Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. On the afternoon of December 17th, 2024, the front steps of the Pearl River County Courthouse in Poplarville, Mississippi, were swept clean, quiet, and cold. Within minutes of a final divorce hearing, a man lay motionless on the pavement, shot multiple times at close range. Witnesses didn't scream. They froze. Security didn't have time to react. The shooter didn't flee. She stood still, gun in hand, calm. When she pulled the trigger, the courthouse was already quiet. But it was never safe. Not for her. A woman pulls a gun. A man drops dead. And in a town like Poplarville, where justice is supposed to be decided inside a courtroom, it bled out across its front steps instead. This is the case of Tanya Lindell Saucier, the woman who once survived a gunshot to the face, and James Ray Saucier, the man who allegedly pulled that first trigger, never lived long enough to stand trial for it. 12:19 p.m. Central Time. Tanya and James had just walked out of the Chancery courtroom after finalizing their divorce. Surveillance cameras on the east side of the Pearl River County Courthouse captured the sequence in precise detail. Tanya exits first, trailed closely by an older male, James. A third person, believed to be a personal acquaintance or hired driver, follows behind. Tanya pauses briefly on the steps. Her right hand moves into her handbag. In under 2 seconds, she draws a Smith & Wesson M&P Shield 9mm. The first shot enters James's upper thorax at point-blank range. He collapses forward. A second shot is fired into his chest, followed by 4 more rounds. 3 of the bullets enter through the right shoulder and neck. 1 strikes his jawline. Tanya lowers the gun, but does not leave the scene. State Representative and practicing attorney Jansen Owen, who had just finished representing Tanya during the civil proceeding, rushes forward. He tackles Tanya to the pavement and pins her down by the shoulders, while simultaneously calling for help. Deputies stationed inside the courthouse exit within 90 seconds. Tanya is taken into custody without incident. No word spoken, no resistance. The autopsy report, filed 3 days later, confirms that James Ray Saucier died instantly due to massive hemorrhaging from the initial thoracic wound. He was 62 years old. The pistol's magazine contained 9 remaining rounds. Tanya's hands tested positive for gunshot residue. She was wearing a gray blouse, black slacks, and carried a structured leather bag where the firearm had been concealed. No secondary weapons were found on her person. From a procedural standpoint, the facts are not in dispute. There was no struggle, no ambiguity about who fired the weapon. The questions lay elsewhere, in the months leading up to the shooting, in the context the camera couldn't capture, and most notably, in what the justice system had already failed to prevent. James Saucier had been out on bond for a felony aggravated domestic violence charge since September 2023. According to police records from Pearl River County Sheriff's Department, he had shot Tanya 5 times during a confrontation at their home. One of the rounds passed through her left eye. She survived but was left permanently blind on that side, with significant facial trauma. Despite the severity of the attack, James was granted pretrial release. His court date was scheduled for March 2025. Tanya filed for an emergency protective order in April 2024. It wasn't granted until November. Even then, James remained at liberty. She was advised to comply with court proceedings, including the pending divorce finalization, which would require her to appear in person, alongside the man accused of trying to kill her. From a psychological profile standpoint, what unfolded on the courthouse steps wasn't spontaneous. The trajectory of Tanya's behavior, according to sources familiar with her mental health evaluations, had been shaped by months of silent withdrawal, hypervigilance, and untreated trauma. She had refused formal PTSD counseling following her injury and had reportedly been experiencing insomnia, paranoia, and weight loss in the weeks prior to the shooting. She never gave a verbal threat, never filed a formal complaint about court-mandated proximity to James. She simply complied. The gun she used was purchased legally. Mississippi law does not prohibit domestic violence survivors from owning firearms unless explicitly ordered by a court, which in her case it never was. Tanya held a valid concealed carry permit at the time of the shooting. Within the first 24 hours, the case drew divided public reaction. Some framed it as a calculated murder. Others called it a consequence of systemic failure, of a court system that delayed justice, exposing a victim to continued fear. District Attorney Halford issued a brief statement. While the events are tragic, the law is clear. We are treating this as a homicide, and prosecution will proceed accordingly. Tanya was booked into Lenoir Rowell Criminal Justice Center that evening. She was charged with first-degree murder. Bail was denied. What complicates this case isn't the crime, it's the history beneath it. In 2023, Tanya survived being shot in the face. The man responsible never faced a jury. In 2024, she pulled the trigger. And now, for the first time, someone will face trial. Whether or not it's the right person is a question no forensic evidence can answer alone. The earliest traceable incident in the Saucier case was filed as Incident Report, New Number 2023-1998A, logged by the Pearl River County Sheriff's Office on September 15, 2023, at 6:34 p.m. The responding officer was Deputy Matthew Loring. The location: a single-story home on Diamond Head Road in Carriere, Mississippi. The report description read simply, "Female victim with multiple gunshot wounds. Suspect detained." Tanya Lindell Saucier was transported to Forest General Hospital with 5 entry wounds: left cheek, left shoulder, abdomen, and 2 in the left thigh. A 6th round missed and embedded into drywall behind her. Emergency medical staff reported that one of the bullets had shattered the left orbital bone. She lost the eye within 48 hours. Her condition was listed as critical but stable. The shooter, identified at the scene as James Ray Saucier, admitted to firing the weapon. Deputies secured a Taurus G2C 9mm handgun from the living room table. Magazine capacity was 12 rounds. 7 had been fired. No signs of struggle were found, no broken furniture, no overturned items. Only the blood trail between the kitchen and entryway and a powder residue pattern on James's dominant hand. James was arrested without incident, charged with aggravated domestic violence involving a deadly weapon under Mississippi Code, paragraph 9737. He was held for 48 hours and posted a $50,000 bond on September 17th. There was no statement from Tanya recorded at the hospital. Her jaw was wired shut for stabilization. Her attorney submitted a written statement 2 weeks later requesting protection and expedited criminal proceedings. That request was denied by the judge on procedural grounds. The district court's docket was backlogged. A pretrial hearing was set for March 18, 2025. 6 months after the attack, there was no appeal. Tanya complied. Forensics were conducted on site within 12 hours of the shooting. The trajectory analysis showed that all bullets were fired from a distance of 3 to 6 feet. Gunshot residue on James's hand matched the firearm recovered. The projectile removed from Tanya's shoulder matched rifling patterns on the Taurus pistol. No evidence suggested a second shooter. The home's single security camera was non-functional. Tanya's medical records confirmed that reconstructive surgery began within 72 hours of admittance. No inpatient psychiatric support was offered. In terms of procedural documentation, everything checked out. The evidence aligned too neatly. That was part of the problem. Despite multiple gunshots, severe bodily injury, and a suspect who admitted to firing the weapon, James Saucier remained a free man under state supervision. The prosecution filed no objection to the bond. Tanya received no formal victim protection status because under Mississippi statute at the time, a protective order required either ongoing cohabitation or threats after the attack. The law had not adapted to high-risk survivorship. This became relevant 6 months later when Tanya filed for divorce and cited irreconcilable fear instead of the attack. Her lawyer, under legal advisement, avoided terminology that might compromise James's criminal trial. They were advised not to speak to media or use language that could suggest retaliation or prejudgment. The result, in court paperwork, the violence barely existed. This absence bled into law enforcement records. In the statewide database, Tanya's name appeared as a domestic assault victim, but her protective order request remained marked pending review for over 130 days. By the time it was approved in late November 2024, James had already been attending pre-divorce hearings in the same room as Tanya for months, and each time, no security escort was offered. When the district attorney's office was questioned post-incident about this delay, the response was clinical. Due process applies equally. Mr. Saucier had not yet been convicted, But due process doesn't shield against proximity. Tanya's court-mandated appearances placed her within 20 feet of the man who shot her, on at least 4 occasions between July and December 2024. The psychological impact of the 2023 shooting was largely undocumented. Tanya declined counseling. She did not complete a victim impact statement. Her attorney noted that she began arriving at hearings in sunglasses, despite overcast weather, and no longer spoke above a whisper. Forensic psychiatry experts who later reviewed the case agreed. Her behavioral profile fit common patterns observed in prolonged exposure to untreated trauma. Compliance masking distress, hyper-awareness without verbalization, avoidance of escalation at any cost, until the cost reversed itself. No single piece of evidence from 2023 could predict the December 2024 outcome, but taken together, the timeline reads like a procedural system pushing paperwork faster than people. A victim survived, a suspect waited for trial, and neither had protection from each other. The state assumed distance meant safety. Tanya knew otherwise. Between April and December 2024, the Saucier divorce proceeded through Chancery Court on schedule, with no extraordinary delays and no formal disruptions. The case number, PRC 24174, appeared 5 times in the Pearl River County Court calendar. Tanya and James Saucier were physically present for all 5 hearings. Each one required shared proximity inside Courtroom B, approximately 700 square feet, with seating for 16. There were no recorded incidents of misconduct or courtroom outbursts. Bailiffs made no incident reports. But the absence of disturbance is not evidence of peace. Court transcripts show that Tanya spoke only once during those appearances, confirming her address. All other statements came through legal counsel. Her behavior was described by one court employee in a sealed internal memo as frozen, disengaged, but compliant. That memo was not part of the criminal file and only surfaced after the homicide. James, by contrast, remained verbal and assertive during proceedings. Audio recordings from the September 3rd preliminary hearing captured him raising objections, correcting his attorney, and once asking the judge directly to require her to answer questions out loud. The judge denied that request. Forensic psychology protocols recognize these behavioral splits. Victims of long-term coercive control, especially those recovering from trauma, often exhibit hyper-compliance under legal supervision. They speak little. They avoid eye contact. They follow rules exactly. To the system, it presents as composure. In clinical literature, it's typically survival. The divorce filings show that Tanya requested no spousal support, no claim to property, no division of marital assets. She asked only for a name change and legal separation. James agreed to all terms, but added one clause, that the divorce be finalized in person with both parties present to sign. Under Mississippi Chancery rules, that clause was legally permissible. The court accepted the stipulation. On November 26th, Tanya was granted a permanent protective order following a delayed hearing that took 7 months to schedule. It prohibited James from contact outside court proceedings, but did not cover court appearances themselves. Her lawyer requested remote accommodation for the final hearing. That motion was denied due to insufficient medical justification. Tanya had no diagnosed psychiatric illness on record. The court followed protocol. The protocol did not account for fear. A court security assessment dated December 1st found no elevated threat indicators for the Saucier hearing. Bailiff staffing was reduced from 3 to 1 for that week due to county budget constraints. Tanya was not offered escort to or from the building. Courtroom surveillance logs confirmed Tanya arrived alone for the final hearing on December 17th. She entered through the east door at 11:56 a.m., signed in at the front desk, and sat in the far left gallery row. James entered 4 minutes later, seated on the opposite side. They never spoke. They never made eye contact. At 12:06 p.m., both stood when their names were called. The hearing lasted 28 minutes. No objections, no comments. Divorce granted. At 12:18 p.m., Tanya signed the final documents and exited through the main stairwell, 1 step behind James. Surveillance doesn't detect emotion. There are no measurements for dread. But those working in the courthouse that day later described an atmosphere they couldn't explain. The deputy clerk recalled feeling tense for no reason, A maintenance worker, reviewing HVAC logs, noted that the room temperature had dropped below average just prior to the noon session, despite no thermostat changes. These aren't indicators, but they're not irrelevant. Security did not follow either party outside. Between the courtroom exit and the first gunshot, 57 seconds passed. What happened next was covered in Chapter 1. But what matters in this chapter is what didn't happen. No one intervened. No one escorted Tanya. No one considered that danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits in silence, well within legal limits. This case reflects a pattern seen in other domestic violence fatalities, where the system's timeline does not match the urgency of risk. Legally, Tanya was divorced, protected, finished. But practically, she was still within arm's reach of the man who shot her 14 months earlier, and the legal system had mandated her presence at that proximity. Risk assessments in Mississippi Chancery Court are not standardized. Judges use discretion, court security staffing is variable across counties, and victims of past violence are still required to engage face-to-face with accused perpetrators if no psychiatric exemption applies. No additional forensic data was collected between December 1st and December 17th. Tanya submitted no additional filings. Her attorney submitted no complaints. James submitted nothing. And the courthouse operated as if the past year had never happened. That assumption cost a life. The entire exchange between courthouse exit and final gunshot spanned less than 60 seconds, but forensic reconstruction would take weeks. On December 18, 2024, crime scene technicians from Pearl River County Sheriff's Office completed their official spatial analysis of the front steps of the courthouse, where James Ray Saucier was pronounced dead. Their report began with a single observation. No signs of physical struggle. Gunshot entry wounds indicate close proximity and deliberate targeting. The weapon recovered was a Smith & Wesson M&P Shield 9mm semi-automatic handgun, serial number FXE21489. It had been discharged 6 times. All shell casings were recovered within a 4-foot radius, consistent with on-body draw and stationary firing stance. The slide had not jammed. Magazine still held 9 unfired rounds. The autopsy confirmed time of death at approximately 12:21 p.m., with forensic pathologist Dr. Leah Murray noting massive internal hemorrhaging due to thoracic perforation of the right ventricle. In total, 3 bullets entered the torso, 2 into the upper right shoulder and pectoral area, 1 grazing the left mandible. 2 rounds struck non-lethal areas, the upper bicep and side hip. 1 lodged in the spine. The pattern aligned with a shooter standing between 3 to 5 feet away and aiming from a slightly higher elevation, a fact supported by the 2 downward-angled trajectories. A single eyewitness statement, later corroborated by security footage, confirmed that the first shot was fired without verbal warning. A secondary point of analysis was gunshot residue, GSR. Tanya Lindell Saucier's hands tested positive within 25 minutes of the incident. The trace levels on her palms and wrists matched the chemical signature of federal premium 9mm ammunition, consistent with the remaining cartridges recovered from the magazine. There was no evidence of a struggle for the firearm, and no other fingerprints, besides Tanya's, were found on the grip, magazine release, or trigger housing. Surveillance footage captured Tanya reaching into her handbag. No attempt at concealment was made. She pulled the firearm, stepped forward, and fired, all in full view of the courthouse security cameras. Frame-by-frame analysis confirmed the timeline. The first round was discharged at 12:20:19 p.m., the 6th at 12:20:26 p.m. Total duration of gunfire, 7 seconds. The most significant post-crime variable wasn't ballistic, it was behavioral. Tanya did not flee. She remained standing, gun lowered, until approached and disarmed by her attorney, Jansen Owen, approximately 14 seconds later. Body cam footage shows Owen shouting for assistance while physically restraining Tanya. She made no effort to resist. A second witness, court maintenance worker Harvey Dillon, provided a signed statement verifying that Tanya had entered the building that morning alone and exited the hearing expressionless, looking ahead. He stated under oath, "She didn't look angry. She didn't look scared. She looked done." A final technical note involved environmental factors. The incident occurred in overcast daylight at 61 with with no rain. Visibility was unobstructed. All visual evidence, video, eyewitness, and physical markers, supported a single shooter hypothesis with no accomplice. Legally, the state's charge was straightforward: premeditated homicide. But among investigators, the complication was never about the bullet paths. It was about context. Forensic evidence in this chapter did not raise new suspects, hidden conspirators, or unexpected anomalies. There were no missing cameras, no tampered files, no unexplained gaps in surveillance. Everything lined up with the narrative already forming. A victim of prior violence walks out of a courtroom with her ex-husband and shoots him dead before anyone can intervene. The problem was, the evidence told the story cleanly, too cleanly. In most courthouse homicides, there's disorder, screaming, running, chaos. Here, there was only action and aftermath. The sterile precision disturbed some analysts more than the violence itself. It suggested planning, but not necessarily revenge, possibly fear, possibly resignation. Either way, the bullets were real, and the body was certified dead by the same state that had failed to protect either party from what it now had to prosecute. James Saucier's body was released to next of kin 2 days later. The family made no public statement. Tanya remained in custody. Her first court appearance on the homicide charge was scheduled for January 2025. On December 19, 2024, less than 48 hours after James Saucier was declared dead, Tanya Lindell Saucier was formally charged with first-degree murder under Mississippi Code, paragraph 97-3-19. The charge reflected intent, deliberation, and premeditation. Her arraignment took place behind closed doors at the Lenoir Rowell Criminal Justice Center. No media, no public seating. Bond was denied. There was no plea that day. Tanya invoked her right to counsel. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for January 5, 2025. The state's argument was simple. Tanya had access to a firearm, waited until the final divorce decree was signed, then used that weapon to carry out a calculated killing on government property. No threats had been issued that day. No self-defense claim had been made at the scene. The shooting, in the eyes of the state, was not spontaneous. It was structured. The prosecution cited surveillance footage, autopsy reports, GSR tests, and eyewitness confirmation as supporting evidence. All were confirmed and uncontested. The DA's team led with structure, not emotion. The aim was to avoid debate on Tanya's past injuries, the failed protective order, or the case James himself was scheduled to face in March. Privately, the tone was more divided. The sheriff's office, which had previously handled James's aggravated assault case in 2023, released a short internal memo acknowledging procedural vulnerabilities in protection enforcement. The memo would not be shared publicly, it remained sealed. But for those close to the case, it raised the uncomfortable question: what happens when a defendant dies before he can be tried? In legal terms, James Saucier's prior case became moot. The charges were vacated on death, the evidence sealed. There would be no conviction, no formal acknowledgement of his alleged violence toward Tanya. Without a criminal record, James returned to legal status as unadjudicated. That status became critical to the narrative the state now had to build. Forensic evidence alone made this a clean case. Motive, however, complicated everything. The defense remained quiet in the early phase. Tanya's legal team submitted a request for a psychological evaluation, citing trauma history and cognitive shutdown. They did not argue innocence. They focused on capacity. Her records from Forest General Hospital's trauma unit were submitted under seal, along with documentation of facial reconstructive surgeries, long-term vision loss, and loss of work capacity. Her legal filings emphasized post-traumatic stress and systemic failures in victim protection. But emotion is not a defense under Mississippi law. Intent is still measured in action. The DA's strategy focused on maintaining the burden of proof, that Tanya had options beyond lethal force, that she had time to act differently, and that she made a choice rooted in retribution, not fear. Prosecutors rejected claims of battered woman syndrome as legally insufficient for acquittal under state statutes without clear evidence of immediate threat at the time of the shooting. One line in the preliminary brief stood out. There was no weapon in the victim's possession. There was no movement toward the defendant. The divorce was final. From a purely procedural standpoint, they were right. The risk had passed. But procedure doesn't always reflect lived reality. Tanya's team prepared for a strategy grounded in diminished responsibility, hoping for a reduced charge, possibly second-degree murder or voluntary manslaughter. But that required careful framing, not just of trauma, but of timing. Why didn't she act earlier? Why now? The courthouse was not a place of physical danger that day, but it had been a place of emotional captivity for months. That argument, though compelling to some, had no legal weight unless it could be tied to her state of mind at the exact moment she pulled the trigger. That's where expert testimony would come in. The court appointed a forensic psychiatrist to evaluate Tanya's competency to stand trial and her cognitive clarity on the day of the incident. That process would take weeks. In the meantime, Tanya remained housed in general population under suicide watch. She was allowed no media access, no direct statements, no visitors besides her attorneys. According to staff logs, she complied with all facility rules, ate her meals, and remained nonverbal with other inmates. From the outside, she presented like someone waiting, not bargaining. By mid-January 2025, the conversation around Tanya Saucier had shifted, from whether she did it to why. Her guilt was never in question. The footage was clear. The forensic evidence lined up. What remained unresolved was whether her mental state at the time of the shooting could legally justify a lesser charge, or even a different legal outcome altogether. A court-ordered forensic psychiatric evaluation was completed on January 13th by Dr. Meredith Qualls, a board-certified psychiatrist with the Mississippi Department of Mental Health. Her task wasn't to determine innocence. It was to assess competency. Was Tanya mentally fit to understand the charges against her? Could she assist in her own defense? And more critically, what was her psychological condition at the time of the shooting? The clinical report was delivered under seal, but summarized for the court in closed session. According to official court records, Dr. Qualls found Tanya competent to stand trial. She was coherent, oriented, and capable of following legal proceedings. However, the second part of the evaluation, the retrospective mental state analysis, was more complex. Dr. Qualls described Tanya's psychological profile as consistent with prolonged trauma response, featuring sustained hypervigilance, emotional dissociation, and impaired threat assessment. In practical terms, this meant Tanya had spent more than a year in a persistent state of perceived danger, often without visible triggers. Her behavior, though controlled on the outside, reflected internal breakdown. The phrase used in the report was chronic conditioned fear response. Tanya had not exhibited impulsivity. She had exhibited finality. This psychological finding did not constitute a legal insanity defense. Mississippi law requires that, at the time of the crime, the defendant must have been unable to distinguish right from wrong due to a severe mental defect. Tanya, by all accounts, understood that killing James was wrong. She simply no longer believed the system would stop him first. Her attorneys filed a motion to introduce this forensic evaluation during trial, not as a defense of insanity, but as evidence supporting a downgraded charge, voluntary manslaughter under the heat of passion doctrine, or alternatively, second-degree murder based on emotional distress. The district attorney's office opposed the motion. They cited the absence of an immediate provocation. James had made no physical threat. The divorce was finalized. There were no new verbal or physical aggressions that day. The state's argument remained focused. Tanya planned the act. Her trauma did not erase the decision. Behind closed doors, legal strategy turned into moral calculus. The public, however, had already made up its mind. Local advocacy groups, some of which had followed Tanya's 2023 shooting case, began to circulate her hospital images from that incident. One photo showed Tanya post-op, with bandages across her face and an empty eye socket. Another included scans showing bullet fragments still embedded in soft tissue near her left jaw. The state did not release these. They were leaked. Public sentiment turned fast. Headlines described her as a victim failed by the courts. Online petitions demanded leniency. Media coverage referenced the phrase institutional abandonment. The narrative no longer centered on murder. It centered on survival that came too late to be sanctioned. Inside the jail, Tanya remained silent. No interviews, no statements, Her behavior remained cooperative. Logs showed that she declined both recreational time and counseling sessions. She was not disruptive, but she was not present either. She existed between compliance and vacancy. A corrections officer, speaking anonymously to a local reporter, described her as the quietest inmate on the unit. She doesn't sleep much. She watches the clock like she's waiting for something. The case was no longer just about a shooting. It had become a referendum on the boundaries of justice and timing. If Tanya had acted a day earlier, before the divorce was finalized, would it have changed the charge? If the protection order had been issued earlier, would she have needed a gun? If the March trial for James hadn't been months away, would she have waited? The evidence remained the same. The system's role in what happened next didn't change the physical act, but it altered the lens through which the act was judged. By late February 2025, Tanya Saussures' case no longer existed solely within the walls of a courtroom. It had become something else, an intersection of law, trauma, media, and public perception. While the charge remained first-degree murder, the legal conversations unfolding behind closed doors had shifted toward damage control. Not from the defense, but from the prosecution. The district attorney's office, which had originally projected confidence in securing a conviction, was now confronting a dilemma with no easy precedent. The forensic evidence had not changed. Tanya had fired the shots. The autopsy confirmed cause of death. GSR was conclusive. No secondary actors were involved. In any typical scenario, this case would be open and shut. But this wasn't typical anymore. 3 weeks after Tanya's psychological evaluation was submitted, legal advocacy organizations had launched campaigns across multiple states, framing her act not as premeditated violence, but as a delayed consequence of a system that had failed to protect her. Several high-profile cases from other jurisdictions were invoked in comparison. One involved a woman in Missouri who had killed her abuser after restraining orders were ignored. Another focused on a Nevada case where prosecutors dropped charges in light of unaddressed trauma. Those cases had different facts, but public understanding rarely differentiates nuance. Internally, the DA's team knew they could not try this case in a vacuum. Jury selection would be subject to extreme scrutiny. Tanya's name was now part of op-eds and television panels. An online fundraiser for her legal fees had surpassed $80,000 within 2 weeks. The office received multiple requests for comment about institutional negligence. They issued none. The trial date had not been set, but the window for plea negotiation had quietly opened. Assistant District Attorney Robert Kinley, the lead prosecutor on the case, initiated contact with the defense team on February 27th. According to internal communications, he proposed a potential deal, a reduction to manslaughter, 20 years with parole eligibility after 10. It was not offered as a concession. It was offered as a containment strategy. The defense rejected it. From their position, the deal still labeled Tanya as the aggressor. Their counteroffer, submitted the following week, requested a plea to voluntary manslaughter with time served and mandatory psychiatric supervision. The DA's office refused. The gap between the two positions revealed more than legal posturing. It revealed the limits of what each side could risk. The prosecution feared losing control of the narrative in open trial. The defense feared allowing Tanya to be sentenced for surviving. Meanwhile, pretrial motions began to shape the battlefield. The state moved to exclude the 2023 shooting incident, arguing that it was not adjudicated and therefore prejudicial. The defense filed to introduce it as evidence of state-enabled exposure to harm. The judge had not yet ruled. The ruling would be pivotal. If the court allowed the prior incident in, the defense could frame the December 2024 shooting not as murder, but as the endpoint of systemic breakdown. If it was excluded, they would be left defending a cold act in broad daylight. Evidence itself wasn't on trial anymore. Interpretation was. As for Tanya, her behavior in detention remained unchanged. According to weekly assessments from facility staff, she showed no behavioral issues, no signs of acute psychiatric distress, but also no indicators of emotional engagement. She followed instructions, attended scheduled legal meetings, and declined media interview requests. Her legal counsel advised against public statements of any kind. What concerned some observers, privately, was that Tanya did not appear to anticipate release. She complied as if the process was inevitable, as if trial or plea made no difference. That posture, while legally irrelevant, created a subtle challenge for her own team. A client without expectation becomes harder to defend in front of a jury. Sympathy without projection is difficult to convert into leniency. Still, the central issue remained. Would this case reach trial? By early March 2025, both sides had submitted sealed briefs outlining their strategies. The judge, aware of mounting public interest, requested additional time before making evidentiary rulings. That delay would push any trial into summer at the earliest. For now, the case was suspended in legal limbo. The charge was still murder. But the courtroom was surrounded by pressure, precedent, and political cost. In early 2025, the Pearl River County courtroom faced one of its most challenging decisions yet. A critical motion was filed regarding whether the 2023 shooting incident, when James Saucier fired upon Tanya, would be admissible as evidence in the upcoming murder trial. The outcome of this ruling would shape the entire direction of the case. After careful deliberation, the presiding judge ruled to exclude the prior shooting from the trial. The rationale was clear. Since James had not been convicted before his death, introducing the incident risked unfair prejudice against Tanya. This decision effectively narrowed the prosecution's focus solely on the December 2024 shooting. The state's case remained legally intact, but crucial context would not reach the jury. This ruling underscored a harsh reality. The legal system, bound by rules of evidence and procedural fairness, sometimes limits the full picture from emerging in court. Justice in such circumstances can be partial, framed by what can be proven beyond reasonable doubt rather than the lived truth. With this hurdle, the case settled into an uneasy pause. Tanya remained incarcerated without bond, held at Lenoir Rowell Criminal Justice Center. The trial date was postponed multiple times, pushed further into 2025 as pretrial motions accumulated and legal negotiations continued behind closed doors. Her defense persisted in pursuing reduced charges, leveraging psychological evaluations and systemic failures. The prosecution remained firm on first-degree murder. Public interest, meanwhile, had not waned. Media coverage highlighted Tanya's injuries, the delayed protective orders, and the ongoing debate about self-defense law in Mississippi. Advocacy groups called for legislative reform, emphasizing that this case was a symptom of broader failures to protect domestic violence survivors. As of June 26, 2025, no verdict had been reached. Tanya's case exists in a legal limbo, a status neither resolved nor dismissed. This prolonged uncertainty is a stark reminder that for many victims, the road to justice is neither swift nor certain. Beyond court records and forensic data, the story of Tanya and James Saucier serves as a reflection on the intersection of law, trauma, and societal responsibility. It reveals how procedural limits and institutional delays can compound human suffering, sometimes culminating in irreversible tragedy. The case challenges us to reconsider how legal systems balance due process with protection, how they weigh evidence against context, and how they support or fail the vulnerable. Tanya's shooting of James was not an isolated act of violence. It was the endpoint of a sequence defined by fear, systemic inaction, and a fractured quest for safety. For communities and lawmakers, the message is clear. Protecting lives requires more than laws on paper. It demands proactive, timely intervention and a justice system responsive to the complexities of trauma. While the courtroom awaits its day, the lessons of this case resonate beyond legal briefs and trial dates. They speak to the necessity of addressing domestic violence comprehensively, ensuring that no survivor faces the crossroads of desperation without a true path to safety. As someone who's walked through the darkest chapters of this story, I want to leave you with this. Life doesn't always give clear answers or justice served on time, but strength comes from understanding our worth and fighting for protection when the system falls short. What would you do if you found yourself trapped between fear and the law? How do we as a community better support those caught in this painful cycle? If this story moved you or made you think, please share your thoughts below. Tell me where you're watching from. And if it didn't quite hit the mark, I want to hear that too. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that reveal the hard truths we all need to face.